Mutation. It is the key to our evolution. It has enabled us to evolve from a single-celled organism into the dominant species on the planet. This process is slow, normally taking thousands and thousands of years. But every few hundred millennia, evolution leaps forward.
Mechanisms of evolution. What is evolution? Evolution is the development of life on Earth. This is a process that began billions of years ago and is still continuing to this day. Evolution tells us how it was possible for the enormous diversity of life to develop. It shows us how primitive protozoa could become the millions of different species that we see today. Evolution, then, is the answer to the question that we have all asked on seeing a Dachshund and a Great Dane together. How is it possible for ancestors to have descendants that look so very different to them? In answering this question, we want to focus on animals, excluding other forms of life such as fungi and plants. The first question to ask is therefore, how can one animal develop into a whole new species of animal? But just a quick question. What exactly is a species? A species is a community of animals that is capable of producing offspring with one another, with those offspring also being capable of reproducing in turn. To understand this answer better, we need to take a closer look at the following points. The uniqueness of living creatures, guaranteed through the excess production of offspring and heredity. And, as a second key point, selection. Let's begin with uniqueness. Every creature that exists is unique, and this is essential for evolution. The members of a species may strongly resemble each other in appearance, however, they all have slightly different traits and characteristics. They may be a bit bigger, fatter, stronger, or bolder than their fellow animals. So what is the reason for these differences? Let's take a closer look at a creature. Every creature is made up of cells. These cells have a nucleus. The nucleus contains the chromosomes, and the chromosomes hold the DNA. DNA consists of different genes, and it's these genes that are life's information carriers. They contain instructions and orders for the cells and determine the characteristics and traits that living creatures have. And it's precisely this DNA that is unique to every creature. It's slightly different from individual to individual, which is why each has slightly different characteristics. But how is the enormous range of DNA created? One key factor is the excess production of offspring. In nature, we can observe that creatures generally produce far more offspring than is necessary for the survival of their species, with many offspring dying an early death as a result. Often there are even more offspring than the environment in which they live is able to support. This is one factor in increasing diversity within a species. The more offspring that are produced, the more little differences occur. And this is what nature wants, as many little differences as possible. The second major cause of the uniqueness of individuals occurs in heredity itself. By the way, heredity means the passing on of DNA to offspring. Two very interesting factors come into play in this process: recombination and mutation. Recombination is the random mixing of the DNA of two creatures. When two creatures fall in love and mate, they recombine their genes twice. The first time they do this separately, when they generate the gametes, that is, sperm and egg cells. The gametes take half of the genes and shuffle them. The second recombination occurs when a male inseminates a female. The parents each provide 50% of their DNA, in other words, 50% of their unique traits and characteristics. These are then recombined or mixed, and the result is new offspring. These offspring have a random mix of the DNA and therefore the traits and characteristics of their parents. This increases the diversity and differences within a species even further. But mutations are also important for evolution. Mutations are random changes in DNA. These can also be described as copying errors within the DNA, triggered by toxins or other chemical substances or by radiation. A mutation exists when a part of the DNA is altered. These changes are often negative and may result in illnesses such as cancer. However, they may also have neutral or positive effects, such as the blue eye color in humans, which is one such random mutation. In all cases, a mutation has to affect a gamete, that is, a sperm or egg cell, because only the DNA in the gametes is passed on to the offspring. This is also the reason why we protect our sexual organs during X-rays, whilst other parts of the body are not at risk. In summary then, in the heredity process, creatures pass on their characteristics to their offspring in the form of DNA. Recombination and mutation change the DNA so that each child looks different to its siblings and receives a random mix of the characteristics of its parents. There's a key word here: random. All of these processes are based on chance. Random recombination and mutations result in individuals with random mixes of traits and characteristics, which in turn mix these randomly and pass them on. But how can so much be down to chance when all living creatures are so perfectly adapted to their environment? For example, the stick insect, the hummingbird, and the frogfish. The answer is provided by the second key point, selection. Each individual is subjected to a process of natural selection. As we have learned, each individual is somewhat different to its fellows, and there is extensive variation within a species. Environmental influences have an effect on living creatures. These so-called selection factors include predators, parasites, animals of the same species, toxins, changes in habitat, or the climate. Selection is a process that each individual is subjected to. Every creature has a unique mix of traits and characteristics. This mix helps them to survive in their environment, or not, as the case may be. Anyone with an unsuitable mix will be selected from the environment. Those with the right mix survive and can pass on their enhanced traits and characteristics. This is why diversity is so important. This is why creatures make so much effort to produce offspring that are as different as possible. They increase the likelihood that at least one of their offspring passes nature's selection process. They maximize their chances of survival. A good example of this can be seen in a group of finches living on a remote island. They are some of the most famous animals in the world of science and are known as Darwin finches, after their discoverer Charles Darwin. And this is the story of those finches. A few hundred years ago, a small group of finches was blown onto the Galapagos Islands in the middle of the Pacific, probably by a big storm. The finches found themselves in an environment that was completely new to them, a real finch paradise, an abundance of food, and no predators. They reproduced rapidly and numerously. The islands were soon heaving with finches. This meant that food supplies became increasingly scarce. The finch paradise was threatened with famine, and finch friends became competitors. This is when selection intervened. Their individuality and small differences, in this case their slightly different beaks, meant that some of the birds were able to avoid competing with their fellow finches. The beaks of some of the finches were more suitable for digging for worms. Other finches were able to use their beaks better for cracking seeds. The finches consequently sought out ecological niches. In these niches, they were safe from excessive competition. They soon began to mate primarily with other finches that used the same niche. Over the course of many generations, these characteristics were enhanced, enabling the finches to exploit their niches successfully. the differences between the worm diggers and the seed crackers became so large that they were no longer able to mate with one another. Different species emerged as a result. Today there are 14 different species of finch living on the Galapagos Islands, all of which are descended from the same group of stranded finches. This is how new species are created by evolution, through the interaction of unique individuals, the excess production of offspring, recombination and mutation in heredity, and finally, through selection. Why is this so important? It tells us where the variety of life comes from and why living creatures are so perfectly adapted to their habitats. But it also affects us personally. Every person is the result of 3.5 billion years of evolution. And that includes you. Your ancestors fought and adapted in order to survive. This survival was an extremely uncertain thing. If we consider the fact that 99% of all the species that have ever lived are extinct, then you can consider yourself part of a success story. The dinosaurs have disappeared, but you are alive, watching this video. Because you're incredibly special, just like all the other creatures that exist today. Irreproducible and unique in the universe.
Mutation has a negative effect on an organism. Also often, a mutation has no noticeable effect. But let's imagine a rarer scenario, where a mutation happens to help the organism adapt to its current environment. For example, maybe it results in thicker fur in an environment that is cold all year round. In this scenario, keeping the critter warm increases its chance of survival and reproduction. All things being equal, this individual will have an advantage. Their traits have a better chance of being passed on in the next generation. This process is called natural selection. What is advantageous in one environment can be disadvantageous in another. For example, we can imagine that in time the climate will change, eventually to be warmer. Now the selective pressure may favor alleles for thinner fur, and then, all things being equal, the frequency of the thicker fur trait will begin to drop. In other words, what selection favors will change, and can be unpredictable as the weather, arguably even more so. Natural selection is often biologists' favorite mechanism of evolution because it results in adaptations that are fun to explore and understand. Detecting natural selection is also quite useful, but we'll talk about that later in the class. It also should be noted that natural selection is not in charge of evolution. It is simply one of 4 mechanisms. Just because a trait is adaptive does not mean it will win out over the other traits. There's still a chance component. One way to think of this is a deck of cards. 2 players are both dealt a hand at random. One player has a pair of aces, the other a pair of jacks. Now, aces are better than jacks for this particular game. But if there are still cards to be dealt, the player with a pair of jacks could still easily win. Natural selection can be thought of as a similar process. Some alleles can have advantages and some disadvantages. But the chance aspect of life still impacts which allele will get the upper hand. In studies of nature, we often operate by seeing the outcome of natural selection. If a researcher comes along and finds evidence for a rapid allele frequency change in a population over time, they would have two competing hypotheses for why that happened. One hypothesis is that the change was coincidental, caused by chance and genetic drift alone. The allele just happened to get sampled very frequently, even though it had no advantage over other alleles. In essence, the allele won the reproductive lottery. The other hypothesis is that the allele was under natural selection. The allele did have an advantage, allowing it to increase in frequency more quickly than one would reasonably expect from chance alone. Thus, the researcher can use statistics and probability to determine whether chance alone can explain the increases in allele frequencies. This is one of several ways we can statistically test whether natural selection has impacted the spread of a trait.
Welcome to the museum. This is a building containing the fossils of dinosaurs and animals that have lived in this planet billions of years ago. The museum is also home to preserved animal specimens taken and studied by researchers through the years. Notice how every animal is different from each other, from their bones and to the way they look. Each of these animals have a unique trait that took long years of evolution and adaptation to accomplish. The animals we see today are descendants from the dinosaurs that we see here. Even we evolved from being an ape to being Homo sapiens. Short neck versus long neck. Here we see bones of a giraffe with a short neck and another from a giraffe with a long neck. This change in the length of the neck was caused by natural selection, which, as stated by Charles Darwin, entails survival of the fittest. Short-necked giraffes were more dominant during the early times, but as the grass they fed on became scarce, they slowly died. Due to the scarcity, giraffes were able to adapt through time by eating leaves from trees, and as a result, giraffes adapted by eventually having long necks. Even plants had to adapt to survive in the environment. That is why trees in the rainforest have been known to reach massive heights as a way to easily absorb the sunlight. Meanwhile, the grasses below have sacrificed a long stem for longer roots so that they can drain more water from the soil. In this picture, we see different kinds of species of cone snails, with each showing a variation from another. All of these come from only one genus, Conus. This is caused by differences in their environment and geographic locations, thus causing a genetic variation with the genus Conus. Even marine animals have adaptations like the great white shark. Its jaws are able to provide the shark to have a massive crushing force in order to capture their prey. The skin of the shark also helps enable them to adapt because their dorsal part resembles the color of the water seen below, while its ventral part is colored white in order to imitate the color of the light passing through the water, allowing a form of camouflage. These are pictures taken from the UST Museum. Did you see anything different in the picture of the birds? There are many differences from their beaks, feathers, and even wingspan. These are results of their adaptations to their environment. Now let's focus on the parrots. Parrots are known to be very colorful birds, and that is what we see here. The interesting thing is that some parrots have different colored feathers. This is the result of mating of parrots that don't have the same color of feathers. This interbreeding in populations creates a genetic variation which can even occur in the subpopulation of the same species, which is called genetic differentiation. These differences show that even animals have limits to what they can do. Their own unique traits also give them constraints like the parrot. Their beaks are shorter compared to the plover, making their beaks useless in picking off small food particles, but this makes their beaks more useful for larger food particles. This difference in beak size is brought about by the food sources that are available in the species environment. The plover's relatively small beak size may have been a cause of availability of only small food particles. On the other hand, the parrot's food resources may have been bigger, but as their beaks are larger than the plover's. Another example of this is a hornbill, which has a bigger beak owing to its bigger prey and resources. Ducks have even different shaped beaks, which are flatter and more dull compared to the sharp beaks of birds. But this is difference that allows the ducks to survive in their environment. Their bills allow them to scoop up the water resources in ponds where they are living, which would have been harder if they have given sharp beaks.
Food resource is only one of the factors that can influence a change in the physical characteristics of the individual. The geographical region and climate can also be a factor which creates clients. A measurable change over a geographic region in the average of some phenotypic character, such as size and coloration. An example of clinal differences can be seen in this chicken. As you can see, our native chicken is different from the chicken found in Japan and China. There is a difference in the coloration where our native chicken has black feathers, while the chickens found from Japan and China have only white feathers, and the domesticated chicken is the bigger one. Another variant of the cline is the ecotype, which is the population adapted to its unique local environmental conditions, as seen in the cloud rat, which is adapted to high elevations as compared to a common rat. The next pictures will show some mammals normally found in forests and their adaptations to the environment and its food resources. Here we see the flying lemur, which still looks the same when compared to normal lemurs. But the biggest difference is their extra patch of skin that allows it to glide from tree to tree as a way to escape predators and as a way to get more food resources. The next picture is that of the squirrel and the flying squirrel. Again, there is not much of a difference between the two, except that the flying squirrel is able to glide. Now, which of the two would be more fit to survive in their environment? Only time will tell, but it looks like the flying squirrel already has the advantage here. We move on to another mammal that can fly, the bat. Its wings are what sets it apart from the other mammals, as they now resemble a bird more, especially when we see them flying in the night. They are still classified as mammals because of their fur, fangs, and claws. These wings allow them to reach heights that most mammals can't, and this is helpful to them because they mostly prey on insects and fruits, unlike the vampire bat that sucks blood from its prey.
Individuals with extraordinary abilities may already be among us.
McTaggart, you really think that some crackpot scientist is going to make me believe in sparkly dames and vanishing men?
I didn't really expect you to believe me. One of the many spectacular things my mutation allows me to do is that I can read your mind.
Are you going to ask us to think of a number between 1 and 10 now?
No, Agent Stryker, although I could ask you about the Jupiter missiles America are currently placing in Turkey.
You brought a damn spy into this facility!
How's that for a
This
magic
video is a
trick?
bit radical with the word mutation when compared to mutations we see in
Best
real
I've ever
life.
seen.
Yes, there really are mutations and they can be beneficial, neutral, or harmful. In your opinion, does this mutation look beneficial to you? A two-headed carabao looks awesome and cute, but it won't help much with the animal. It may have detrimental effects and lead to the early death of the animal. Once again, natural selection is at work here. Most mutations that are harmful do not survive long, thus eliminating the chance of the individual genes to be passed on.
Myths and misconceptions about evolution. Let's talk about evolution. You've probably heard that some people consider it controversial, even though most scientists don't. But even if you aren't one of those people, and you think you have a pretty good understanding of evolution, chances are you still believe some things about it that aren't entirely right. Things like, evolution is organisms adapting to their environment. This was an earlier, now discredited theory of evolution. Almost 60 years before Darwin published his book, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed that creatures evolve by developing certain traits over their lifetimes, and then passing those on to their offspring. For example, he thought that because giraffes spent their lives stretching to reach leaves on higher branches, their children would be born with longer necks. But we know now that's not how genetic inheritance works. In fact, individual organisms don't evolve at all. Instead, random genetic mutations cause some giraffes to be born with longer necks, and that gives them a better chance to survive than the ones who weren't so lucky. Which brings us to survival of the fittest. This makes it sound like evolution always favors the biggest, strongest, or fastest creatures, which is not really the case. For one thing, evolutionary fitness is just a matter of how well suited they are to their current environment. If all the tall trees suddenly died out and only short grass was left, all those long-necked giraffes would be at a disadvantage. Secondly, survival is not how evolution occurs. Reproduction is. And the world is full of creatures like the male anglerfish, which is so small and ill-suited for survival at birth that it has to quickly find a mate before it dies. But at least we can say that if an organism dies without reproducing, it's evolutionarily useless, right? Wrong. Remember, natural selection happens not at the organism level, but at the genetic level. And the same gene that exists in one organism will also exist in its relatives. So a gene that makes an animal altruistically sacrifice itself to help the survival and future reproduction of its siblings or cousins can become more widespread than one that is solely concerned with self-preservation. Anything that lets more copies of the gene pass on to the next generation will serve its purpose. Except evolutionary purpose. One of the most difficult things to keep in mind about evolution is that when we say things like genes want to make more copies of themselves, or even natural selection, we're actually using metaphors. A gene doesn't want anything, and there's no outside mechanism that selects which genes are best to preserve. All that happens is that random genetic mutations cause the organisms carrying them to behave or develop in different ways. Some of those ways result in more copies of the mutated gene being passed on, and so forth. Nor is there any predetermined plan progressing towards an ideal form. It's not ideal for the human eye to have a blind spot where the optic nerve exits the retina, but that's how it developed, starting from a simple photoreceptor cell. In retrospect, it would have been much more advantageous for humans to crave nutrients and vitamins rather than just calories. But over the millennia, during which our ancestors evolved, calories were scarce, and there was nothing to anticipate that this would later change so quickly. So, evolution proceeds blindly, step by step by step, creating all of the diversity we see in the natural world.